Okay, my name is Larry Kirby. I live right nearby in Manchester. I was involved in World War II. I served in the Marine Corps for 3.5 years. And the only reason I'm here is because I'm old. Really. Because World War II ended 73 years ago. I'm so old that my ears are still ringing from the Big Bang. But because there are so few veterans of the Marine Corps combat and down the Pacific Islands still alive, I have suddenly become an important relic, and I've been asked to speak to people and talk about it. And I've written a book, and I know Ernie's a good friend of mine, and I'm married. I just recently celebrated my 72nd wedding anniversary. That was on April 11th. My wife celebrated her 92nd birthday on April 9th. When I came home from serving in the war back in 1945, I started college. I met this beautiful girl. I hounded her for 8 weeks until she went with me. We eloped, went to New York and got married. And we've been happy ever since, and we've been living in Manchester for the last 62 years. That's my introduction.
Thanks,
You're welcome.
Mark.
So my name is Marc Levy. I live in Salem, and I was in the Army from 69 to 71. I was an infantry medic with the 1st Cavalry in Vietnam, and then during the Cambodian invasion, we were there for about 7 weeks. And I've been living in Salem for about 7 years. Before that, I lived in Gloucester, and I've lived in New York, and I've lived abroad.
Thanks.
I'm Tom Laaser from Salem. I was in the Army for 5 years, the entire time in Fort Drum, New York, which is on the Canadian border. They always said, who in personnel did you anger? You should never spend that much time in the cold. I was an artilleryman, which means you just shoot a giant Cadillac-sized gun. 1 year of which I spent shooting that gun in Afghanistan in 2013 to 14. And I was medically retired from the Army and turned to writing as sort of the way to fix my life. And nothing can be done solo, even writing. And I created sort of a community around myself. I got a bunch of other vets of my era together and said, you're going to write, and we're all going to write together. And we created the Salem Veteran Writers Workshop, which has been going on 2 years now and really been producing some great work and some community and helping all of us kind of find a way to continue serve. I'm married, only 10 years. Hopefully someday I can be saying 70 odd years with my wife. I was married to her before the Army, and she stuck through everything with me. So we always say we've been through the worst, so hopefully it's all the best from there.
We've asked each of you to come here as writers. Could you just each tell us about your writing, what you've done, the type of writing you do, if you still do, or have done in the past? Larry, why don't we start with you?
Oh, why I wrote this book?
Or what you wrote. Tell us about it.
Well, this book is it's called Stories from the Pacific. It's 21 stories that deal with events in which I was involved while I was down in the Pacific Islands. About half of them are kind of sad. They're actual accounts of combat and what you think about in circumstances like that. And the others are quite humorous, because living down there, I was down in the islands for a little over 2 years, but I was in combat probably for only 3.5 months. So there's a lot of training time between landings. I landed on Bougainville, and then the island of Guam, and then I was sent to Iwo Jima. And I arrived over there in 43. I left Guam to come home at war's end in late in 45. And I've always wanted to put down on paper what I did down there and the things we did and the fun I had. Poking fun at officers mostly, but I originally wanted to leave a manuscript for my children. I wrote this about the time that Ken Burns produced his documentary on the Civil War, and I noted that in that film he would refer to a soldier in the Civil War, either one side or the other, who had written an account and left it for his family, and somebody opened a dusty drawer many years later and took it out and read it, and Burns used it in his film. And I thought that I should write an account of what happened to me down there and give one to each of my children and let them keep it. So I dreamt that maybe 100 years after I died, somebody would go up in an attic and open an old trunk and find this manuscript. And they'd say, oh, that's what great-great-great-grandfather Kirby did in World War II. And that's all I intended to do. But then my sister Mary, who was a nosy person to begin with, she read a copy. She had a friend who was a literary agent, and well, it got published. That was 23 years ago. It's been a long time. It sold about over that time about 75, 100,000 copies, and it's still available on eBay. But no, not eBay, Amazon. But I get no royalties from it, so I don't care whether you buy it or not. Because I gave the creative rights to the publisher. In return, he reduced the price by a couple of dollars, so I wanted as many people as possible to read it. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Absolutely. Mark, tell us about your writing, what you've written and published, and maybe what you're doing now if you're working on something.
So I started writing actually in Cambodia. I had a dream, a nightmare, and maybe we'll get to that. And I started writing down my dreams when I got back to the States, just writing down my nightmares. And I did that on and off for about 30 years. And that was the first book I ever published. It's just a collection of 100 nightmares, which I'm sure is on your Christmas list. And then in the years after the war, starting around the 80s, I started traveling. So I traveled a little bit in Central America and Asia and Indonesia. So those travels became part of a group of stories. So the first book I wrote is composed of the nightmares. It's called Dreams Vietnam. The second book is called How Stevie Nearly Lost the War and Other Post-War Stories. It's composed of just that, stories that have less to do with actual warfare than what it's like to be impacted by war and live just what's the daily life, mostly of a veteran. So romance and just daily interactions and a couple of travel yarns and a little bit of war in between. And the next book is going to be a collection of 350 dreams. From September 2017 to 2018, I wrote down my dreams every day for 365 days. Try doing that sometime. So these dreams, what makes it interesting is they run the gamut. War dreams are still there, but not as bad. And then just kind of mom and pop dreams, and occasionally some kind of gem that rises up from the unconscious. So those are my books.
Thank you. Tom, tell us about what your writing is like.
Sure. So as I said, I was medically retired in 2016. I was injured in Afghanistan, and I had a very, very difficult transition out of the military and into civilian life. And it was really hard going. It was sort of a lost period of my life, and I spent a number of months in a psychiatric hospital, actually. And through every battery of tests and talk therapy or medication or things, I wasn't getting any better. And I finally found my way into an art therapy program that they had. And somebody had said, just write a poem, write a poem that's just yelling at me about how much you hate all of this. And I did. I actually wrote like a 30-page poem about how much I hated the art therapist. And after I gave her this poem, she said, well, how do you feel? And I said, a lot better. And that was sort of my first light bulb of sort of facing things that had happened and not running away from them. And writing was extremely difficult, and there was something in me that wanted to return to being that kind of person that was always up for a difficult challenge. And next thing I know, I had to move forward and apply to school, and I'm at Salem State now studying English. And as I said, I created the writing group because I couldn't do it alone. And I primarily have written and published nonfiction essays in a few journals. The first that was published was a detailed account of one suicide attempt I had that landed me in the psychiatric ward to begin with. And getting it out there and getting a response from people who were genuinely interested was so encouraging. And I continue to write nonfiction and poetry, and I'm currently working on a fictionalized version of my platoon's deployment to Afghanistan. There were 23 of us that deployed to Coast Province, Afghanistan. Everybody, all 23 of us returned living. There are about half of us alive now due to suicide. And in order to honor them, I have started writing this book, sort of detailing each of theirs as best as I know it and best as I can imagine it, their transition as we've all kind of tried to come to terms with what we lived through.
Mark.
I just want to add that both Tom and I have attended the annual Writers' Workshop at the William Joyner Center, which is located at UMass Boston. So if you're a vet, or if you're just someone who wants to get involved in writing, they're on the net. Their next workshop starts in the latter part of June. It's a great way to spend a couple of days this week. This year it's only 1 week long.
It is a fantastic community of different people and different ages. And I went last year and was just a fly on the wall and didn't say 2 words to anybody, and it was still incredibly, it was just a great experience.
I think for any of you, can you comment on well, I guess it's for Larry and Mark. Tom's talking about writing as therapy and as recovery process. Does that resonate with the two of you?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Can you talk about how your experience with that?
I don't want to take up too much time, but as I said, I was involved in 3 landings. Bougainville was bad, Guam was worse, and Iwo Jima was hell. I was in a platoon of 49 young people, and our lieutenant was Lindblad, Lieutenant Mr. Lindblad. He was 23 years of age. He had graduated from college, and now he's made a second lieutenant out of OCS. I was the next in command, and I was older than every other Marine in our platoon, and I was 20 years old. They were all teenagers. And when we lost 22 of those young boys who were killed on Iwo Jima, it did a job on me. I couldn't sleep because I kept seeing their faces, and I thought I was going to go crazy for a while. I considered suicide, ruled it out. I said, that's stupid. But there was no way that I could stop seeing them. So when I came home, I was sent home after traveling all the way across the Pacific and across the country. When I got to the East Coast, I was sent to a hospital in Maryland, in Bainbridge, Maryland, where I was treated in a psychiatric facility for psychiatric treatment and evaluation. And I had a marvelous doctor who cared for me. I was there about 6 weeks. I used to meet with him twice a day. And he was trying to just talk me through this bad thing. And he taught me something very, very important, very real. He said, those 22 boys who were your friends, and I loved them dearly. I knew each one of them personally. We'd gotten to know each other over years. He said, don't try to forget their faces. You can't. They'll be in your mind for the rest of your life. And don't try to forget of the horror you've seen, because that's part of you now. You will always remember it. He said, reach out, embrace it, and bring it into part of your life. And that way, you will be able to control it. As I said, I kept seeing the faces of these 22 boys, and he taught me how to remember them, but at a specific time in the day. So I used to see the 22 faces in the morning, in the evening, and in the afternoon and the evening. And even today, every morning when I wake up, I sit there and I see each face of those boys. And remember their names, how they were killed. And it's strange. Here I'm almost 94 years old, and they're still 17, 18, and 19 years old. But I still see them. And he also told me, Dr. Cafferty was his name, great guy. He told me, don't try to forget what happened to you. Go home and talk about it. It's part of you. Put your arms around it and embrace it. So when I came home, I wanted to talk to my family and to my friends and tell them what I'd been through, but I couldn't, because when I tried to speak, my voice would choke and my whole body would go numb. It was a strange thing. And I know there's a doctor in the house, but you can't explain that. But I just couldn't say it. So I gave up trying, and I married, we had children, I'd gone to school, into law school, and I was very, very busy, which was a great thing. I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself. I just charged off in life, and my life was great. And still, every now and then, I'd be at a cocktail party and somebody would ask me a question about this or that. If it bordered on the war, I'd just choke up and I couldn't say it. And it took many, many years before I could actually talk about my experiences. And when I did, I was talking to my lovely wife, Mary. And she said, you know, each time you tell me that story, it's exactly the same, word for word. You should write it down for our children. So the genesis of this book is really in the psychiatric treatment I received from Dr. Cafferty. He said to write it down, to make it part of you. And I wrote it more for me than for anybody, because I could talk to the book. I didn't have to speak to the people. I wrote down everything that happened to me in these books. And then as I was writing, I realized that my time in the islands was not just all war. A lot of it was off time. So there were a lot of tricks we played and fun we had in doing crazy things. And although I was a platoon sergeant and I was responsible, I was in command of this whole platoon of young Marines, but I was the worst sergeant that they've ever had in the Marine Corps, because most jarheads will worry about the sergeant when they're going to do something. With my guys, I was part of the plot. I assisted them. I went on the theory that if we work as a unit in getting into mischief, we will work as a unit when we get into combat. We will know each other more. And I think that was quite successful. But I included each one of them in here, like the time we burned down the Officers Club. As much planning went into that as the invasion of Guam. But it was very, very successful. And it was so exhilarating to watch that building burn on the night that all the officers in the 9th Regiment were going to have a big party. And all I could do was stand around and watch this thing turn to ashes. And I had being a very careful guy, I made sure that I was out of harm's way and never got blamed for it. And none of my guys did. We blamed it on the Navy sailors who put up the lights on. But the real terrible parts, I was able to describe them in here, and I can now say them, but in the beginning I couldn't. And am I talking too long?
No.
But that's, I guess that's enough about the book. I'm sorry.
Mark?
Larry, the only reason everybody's clapping is because you burned down the O Club. That's the only reason.
So, could you repeat the question?
So, I don't remember the question. I think we were talking about, Tom was talking about starting writing as a therapy process, and its transition and treatment. And I guess the question is there an element of that in your writing, or does that resonate with you, that idea?
Well, when I came back, I didn't realize how much the war had impacted me. So if you fast forward from, say, 71 when I got out to 86, which is when Platoon came out, I saw it every week for 3 months straight. And I wondered why people in New York at the Astor Theater, and I wondered why people weren't doing the same thing.
That's the movie Platoon?
Yeah, the movie Platoon. Because that was the war that I saw, that kind of jungle-y movie. And I eventually started seeing some what we call vet center therapists, some good, some not so good, but generally worthwhile experience. And I had my dreams, my nightmares, and I would write that down, really not know why. And then I started writing little vignettes down, but it just really didn't go anywhere. I met a girl in New York, and she encouraged me to just write cathartically. Didn't matter, and about Vietnam, just write and write. So I cranked out a lot of garbage. And eventually I got to go to the William Joyner Center, and that's where the writing got a little more disciplined. And I started shifting away from the cathartic stuff to a little more craft, a little more expert, just more polished writing. But I think the best way to say how therapeutic, how to express the therapeutic value was to be a little bit sideways. I think the second time I was at Joyner, I was sitting in a hall, kind of like this, and there were about this many people. It was orientation day. So there were 100 students, and we're listening to the faculty for that year, those 2 weeks of the workshop. And so there's some pretty heavy-duty American writers. And but on the side, there were 5 Vietnamese guys, and they were flown in. They were special guests. And one of them was a guy named Bao Ninh, who I had written to 2 years before. He wrote a book called The Sorrow of War. He's a heavy combat North Vietnamese guy. And of the 500 people in his unit, 10 survived. So, great book, by the way. It's a love story in combat. So I saw him. I knew him from the cover of the book, the author photo. And when I first saw it, I had a nightmare that night, because those are the kind of people that hunted us and who we hunted. So the 5 guys each gave a 5-minute speech, translated into English. They were at a podium. And then they started heading back, walking on by the side of the wall to the back of the room. And there were all these people to my left and right sitting in chairs, and I had to hop over them and say, excuse me. And then I finally was in a little aisle, and I called out, Bao Ninh. And he heard me, and he turned around, and he looked at me, and his thoughts were, who is this guy? Who among the Americans knows who I am? And I shouted out my name. I said, it's Marc Levy. And he went, Marc Levy, like that, because he didn't speak English. And he came to me, and it was like 2 brothers coming together, bam, like that. And this is a little guy. He's like 5'6", maybe 135, 40 pounds. And he's wearing sandals and polyester pants. And he put his arms around me, and he clapped my back, and he lifted me up, and he set me down. Yeah. And then, this is the therapeutic part of the movie, I started crying, and I couldn't stop. And that went on for about 10 minutes. And finally, I was able to stop, and we agreed to meet the next day. And I interviewed him for 3 hours, and it goes on. The point being that I had been sitting on that grief for, at that point, 35 or so years. And it just needed that catalyst of meeting the enemy in peacetime to get the ball rolling. So that's my deepest answer to the question.
Thank you. Larry, you told us that you wrote your book to your children, if I understand correctly. Mark and Tom, do you have a particular reader in mind when you're writing? Do you picture someone that you're writing to, or is it something that's just happening within yourself?
I would almost feel like I'm talking in a mirror in a way. A lot of where it sort of starts is I need to retell myself the story. I never have a particular audience in mind. I think that, especially with military experience, there's something that's just extremely human about it that I think anybody could resonate on some level. So I think it's really just sort of starting with myself and creating a narrative for what I'm feeling, and then hopefully the audience is there.
I kind of assume that there's a niche audience that wants to read this stuff, but still I have to kind of make my mind blank to keep things balanced. I've got to just keep reminding myself to keep the reader in mind, and then I want to engage the reader. I don't want to overwhelm the reader, which I do sometimes anyway, because some of the stuff I read about, even though it's post-war, it's a little bit off the charts. Right? But so I try to mellow it out with a little bit of humor, a little bit of irony, or whatever.
So Tom was talking a little bit about how he's continuing to write, and it sounds like it's gone through some changes as far as from where you started. And excuse me, Mark is also had another book. Have you given any thought to, kind of, since you had these stories regarding your time in the South Pacific, you've had some time since then with your fantastic wife that put up with you for 73 years. Have you thought about putting some more words down and sharing, some more of your life and where it's gone from the South Pacific to where it is today?
You mean another book?
Yes.
No.
No?
No, I've never considered that. As I said, this was written to help me and to help me communicate with my kids and my wife, and that was the origin of it. No, I would never write another book for one simple reason. Writing is very, very hard work, and I'm somewhat lazy. When I was writing this, of course, it's so much easier to write with a computer, a word processor. But you can't edit it on your monitor. I'm sure you'd agree with that. So I would, and the only way to write a book is to sit down at 9 o'clock and write for 3 hours every day, no matter what you write. I found that I just have to sit and write. I might write 2,000, 2,500 words. Then I print it out, and I blue pencil it myself. And I got to say, well, this paragraph should be down here, and well, actually, it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't even be in at all. I throw it out, and then start correcting it, trying to keep the flow right so that my reader will be interested in what I'm writing. And after editing it and cutting and everything, I might realize that 2,000 words is now down to 600 or 800. And then when I start compressing it, and I'll say, this sentence doesn't add anything, and this paragraph doesn't, I'll take that out. And a lot of days, I'd write for 3 hours and end up just tearing it up and throw it in the wastebasket and start over again the next day. It's very, very hard work, because you think that you can just sit and write a story. Well, then when you read it, it's terrible. really lousy. You have to be very professional about the way you write. And it's a talent to write. It's a talent to not to write, but to recognize good writing. So that when I read my stuff and it was terrible, I knew enough to edit it and get rid of it until it was good, well enough. And could you agree with that?
It's a great point. Writing is work. And there's a great writer named Larry Heineman. He wrote a book called Paco's Story, which I encourage you to read. And the connection is that Larry once said to me that he realized in Vietnam that war is work. Combat is work. It's all it comes down to.
Yeah.
You go from the work of war to the it's really labor. It's the work of writing. It's just sometimes exhausting. But at the same time, the payoff is you're engaged. When you get into that groove and you're into the creative process, for lack of a better phrase, it's really a great feeling. And whether you have it, you can have that same feeling ice skating or baseball or whatever. So if you're sitting there at the computer or with a pencil and pad and the muse arrives, there you go.
Tom, does this work for you as well?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that a lot of people assume there is an element of talent to it, that you just have to have an ear, I think, for it. And then so much of it is, my method actually is the same. I hate computers, so I will actually type everything out and print it, and I do the same exact thing with a pencil, and seeing it is really more better. But yeah, it's a lot of returning to it, especially first off when I would write a lot of things. Editing is the toughest part. I think anybody can write and get it all out there, especially if it's something really, really emotionally charged for you. The second step to return to it with sort of a detached mind and make it a good story is a totally different level that I think takes a lot of skill. One thing I had that I wanted to ask the two gentlemen here was, so much of being a good writer is at first being a good reader and getting that ear, which we kind of touched to. So I was always a voracious reader. I was that annoying guy on deployment that had a duffel bag of books that thankfully I was an NCO, so I made my guys carry. But I kind of wanted to hear from the two of them about sort of prior to writing, was there sort of a literary intake or an inclination that was already there?
Oh yeah, I could say that I've always been a reader. Joseph Conrad was one of my favorites. He was the master of the adjective. He was weak on dialogue, but descriptions were unbelievable. And poetry as well. Alexander Pope, William Butler Yeats. When I was in high school, I used to read their books. And I would go to the library and take out books that I wanted to read that we had not yet reached in high school, because in high school we're still reading, well, how can I say, well, when we were translating Latin, we were reading Caesar's Gallic Wars, and I wanted to get on to the Aeneas. I'm getting tongue-tied here. I wanted to get on to the Peloponnesian Wars as they were written and worded by Aeneas, and I learned to translate. I went to a pretty good school, so I was taught to read Attic Greek, and I translated the classics from Greek into English. So I was always a reader. And I was always a little different from the rest of the guys in my class in high school. I don't know why, but when they'd skip school to go see the Red Sox, I used to go to the Museum of Fine Arts.
You were different.
I loved looking at the Impressionists. And I got a job in the library when I was a kid, putting books back in the stacks, in the shelves. I had to learn the Dewey Decimal System, but I really wanted to get in there so I could get my hands on the books and read them. And I eventually got fired for reading on the job. But I've just enjoyed reading. But reading and writing are two different things, because I, as a writer, in writing this book, I knew what I wanted to convey to my audience. But to have the skill to have them read and I speak to them, I could say it was like this. You don't understand, it was like this. Well, when you're writing it, you can't correct yourself. You get one pass at it. And as I said earlier, I was the tough. So as I was saying, I was the toughest critic of my own writing. So I edited the heck out of it. This is 183 pages. I'll bet I wrote 1,000 pages. But I'm wandering here. You're up.
Mark, were you a reader before you wrote?
I was, and my father used to give me books every once in a while to read. That kind of started it. And then when I was in high school, I didn't make it to honors English, but I wanted to read what they were reading. So I broke into the storage room where they kept the books for honors English. And that's where I started to get a little better than what they gave the rest of the school. When I was in Vietnam, there was like a little department in the Army. I think it was like the library service. And they would get books to the grunts in the field. They come in the mailbag. So every week or two, we'd get magazines and paperback books. So I remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front for the second time while on patrol. I also read Guy de Maupassant's collected short stories in basic training, another first. And I read, I was active in the anti-war movement while I was still in the active duty service at Devon's. There was a little cafe outside of the base called the Common Sense Bookstore. And I would hang out there, which gets me back to writing. I just realized that there was a professor from BU who would come there about every 2 weeks and hold a little informal writing seminar, poetry and stuff. But I'm still reading today, and I kind of keep it as wide as I can.
So Tom, Larry talked a little bit about where he got the meat and potatoes of his stories were the trials and tribulations of the South Pacific and some of the activities that he got up to when he was there. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess more specifically, the writing that you've done and want to do, and I guess it sounds like you are doing, specific to the theater?
I think thus far, what I've gotten published and what I've written about has always been sort of post-Army and sort of that mirror thing again of reflecting where I am now. And what I'm currently working on is getting more into that, into the actual deployment that I had in Afghanistan. We were in Coast on the Pakistan border, and we were actively shooting artillery almost every day. And I think when I first got into writing, it was easier in a way to kind of look at myself now and say, okay, this is me, and keep that at an arm's length. That I think comes with hopefully time. I think these two gentlemen have more time where they can sort of get that time's distance, arm's length from those events, and then get into sort of the meat of the details of it. It's something I'm sort of sifting through right now. It's certainly easier to come up with sort of the funnier events, as Larry kind of said. There are moments that I wrote one short thing about when I first was promoted to sergeant. I came back to the little hut that we were staying in, and my guys congratulated me by taking everything from my little spot, including my bed, and putting it on the roof. So I came back to that, and I wrote a story about it, and just to kind of capture it and to remember it, and to think about all the guys that aren't alive anymore that took part in that. It really meant a lot to me to sort of separate the memory and put it in a tangible way, and to relook at it and in a way sort of relive it. So it's much easier to start with sort of the funny stories. There's a lot of things on deployment I honestly haven't touched yet. Even talking about that hopefully with time and with sort of being more confident as a writer, perhaps those things will come.
How about you? Specifically, you were with the Cav in fairly challenging area and challenging time. I know a lot of your stuff is based surrounding the dreams that you've had and whatnot, but how much of the meat and potatoes is real world stuff?
Well, what I did was, after I got my feet wet at joiner, I learned to steel. So so it doesn't matter if a war story is comprised of my stuff, someone else's stuff, something that I dreamed, something that I pulled off the internet, as long as I don't plagiarize. So what I did was I learned to find a way to synthesize my direct experiences with stuff that I invented or that I blurred and elaborated upon. As long as it's unbelievable, as long as it's engaging, so as long as there's a sense of and the reader feels tension and the reader wants to know more. Yeah? I had to learn to not hew to the truth of my experience. I had to learn to just open up and let go of this need to bear witness to my personal experience. It just doesn't have to be that way. A friend of mine who was a very good writer and an actor and a poet and an editor kind of drilled that into me. You want it to work, that's great. You don't have to keep it, so attached, so bonded, so welded to your personal truth. What matters is if the reader is engaged by it. What matters is if the reader believes what you've written. When you satisfy the reader, you're a good writer. If you're just writing to get the truth out so that you get attention, I mean, that's fine, that has its place, but a real writer wants to engage the reader with his talent, not just with his ego.
Larry, you're shaking your head over there. Your stories are more factually based. How does what Marc just said resonate with you?
The verity, the truth. Well, I've never plagiarized, but I must admit I'm affected by other writers. William Manchester, Goodbye Darkness. You tend to adapt the style of another writer, or his method of using short paragraphs, or you go to I'm not sure. I can't think of one to use as an example, but I was a chronic reader, so I know I was affected by the books that I read. Hemingway wrote in declaratory sentences, and that's his style. So I've used that to a certain extent in the book to make a point. But I was always writing about my personal experience, and my problem was to convey to my readers how I felt about that experience, to tell them exactly what happened and how it affected me. And I did use other writers' techniques.
Can you give me an example of a story?
Of writing?
Yeah, just pick one of the stories that you wrote about. Tell us about it, and then just kind of.
Well, I mentioned Manchester in Goodbye Darkness. He was talking about the Battle of Okinawa, and he was talking about a particular incident that happened to him, where he lost a companion, a good friend. He was with him when he died. Well, that also happened to me on Guam. One night I was assigned to a listening post with Luz Benning, who was my best friend. I knew this kid so well that we were making plans to live together after the war. Get married, probably become attorneys or whatever, and start a business. But we're going to spend our lives together. And I was with him on a listening post, and it was a routine listening post but there are enemy soldiers coming over this ridge, and we were supposed to identify them. And it's all part of war. And a flare went off, somebody fired a rifle, and the bullet went right through my friend's chest and killed him. And I had to sit in the dark, just around midnight. I had to sit in the dark and hold him in my arms as he died. And the blood was seeping from his wound into my dungarees and getting saturated. And I was whispering in his ear, trying to encourage him, knowing that he was going to die, and he probably knew he was going to die. And I listened to him as he began to hallucinate, thought he was with his mother. And then finally I felt him, just that little shake when somebody passes from life to death. And I still had to hold him in my arms for another 4.5 or 5 hours. I thought I would go crazy. So in order to convey that story in this book, I used the technique from Goodbye Darkness in Manchester. So, but I didn't take his words, just the method that he used. And I agree with you. You are the product of what you have experienced and what you've read. You can't help but be affected by the books that you read. And I hope that gives you some idea what would make sense.
You've talked about reading other authors. Do you read other people that are writing about their military experience these days, or is that something you don't do?
I would say, yeah, I definitely read a lot of Brian Turner. The wealth of literature that came out of Vietnam, I definitely dive into Tim O'Brien and Larry Heineman and all those other guys. For me, it feels like sort of the brotherhood of the military is you also have this brotherhood of veteran authors. And also, it's very interesting when you start to look through it, that lens. You have Hemingway, you have Fitzgerald, you have a lot of actually great American literature that's not specifically about war experiences. It's also veteran literature. So it gets kind of interesting in that you can't really shy away from veteran literature. It's almost ubiquitous in America. But to go to the question, yes, I do deliberately search out sort of my cohort.
I kind of have the opposite problem. I can't read war stories. They set me off. I get really rattled, roused up. When I was in college, I came across this book called Dispatches by Michael Hare. He was one of the screenplay writers for Full Metal Jacket. He and Stanley Kubrick and Gustav Hasford wrote that movie, a great movie. And so there I am around age 27 or so, and I'm walking around campus with this book, which is a collection of vignettes about this guy's experiences in the war as a reporter. And I felt like I was a Christmas tree, and I was lit up, and I didn't know what was going on. And didn't put it together for a long, long time. It took me, when I was living abroad in New Zealand, in a little room in what's called the nurses' quarters, where I worked in a hospital. And I came across this book by Bao Ninh called The Sorrow of War. This is the guy who was from North Vietnam. And I would read it in my little cubicle room. It was like 9 by 4 or 5 square foot room. And this little World War II spring coil mattress, and I would feel like I was levitating off my bed, and that would go on for like an hour and a half, and I'd float back down. I had no idea what that was all about. So since I've been writing, it's what influences my writing is not the war stuff. I read literary journals and some fiction and nonfiction. I keep a little notebook. I write down phrases, I write down words, I write down ideas. But frankly, I avoid anything that has to do straight war stuff.
Larry, you're nodding.
No, I don't even watch films of the war. No, that's not fun for me. I don't. But it's interesting. At least I think I wrote a poem in here, and the reason I did was I wrote the story, And I didn't feel it was adequate. And I remember, maybe just at the war ended, when I was sailing home, I wrote this poem. And I kept it. So I think I'll put the poem in here. It might help to just explain to the reader what I was trying to say. And I have the poem in here. Should I read it?
Will you read it?
If I can find it. Yeah, here it is. The circumstance was this. I was a reconnaissance scout. My job was I was not only the platoon sergeant, but my job was early in the morning when we're in the jungle, just as the sun's coming up. There's a brief period between the end of darkness and the beginning of daylight. It's hard to explain. You can't really see anything, but you can see people moving. And at that time, I used to report to the company CEO, usually a captain, and I used to wear camouflage. I'd have my face all painted and sticks stuck in my helmet and all that. And my job was to go out into the jungle for as far as I could go and try to get information. I would go out and very carefully move slowly through the jungle until I could see maybe a Japanese soldier in a defensive position from where his outfit was. And I was smug enough to think I was very good at it, because I only had to worry about me. I didn't have to worry about anybody. And I grew up in a very tough neighborhood during the Depression, so that I took care of myself. Nobody ever picked on me. They didn't dare. I knew how to take care of myself. So I was fully equipped mentally to be this job of being a scout, a reconnaissance scout. And I'd say go out, I'd find whatever information I could, bring it back to the company commander, and each company had its own scout, and collectively the information those scouts got would give the regimental commander or even the division commander an idea of what to do on his next move. And one morning, I was out scouting, and I saw a thin wire. It would look like a spider web across the front. The jungle is a maze of ferns, and it's just a jumble of everything. And I saw this thin wire, and I didn't know whether it was a spider thread or whether it was a very thin wire. I could see the sun glancing off the moisture on it. And I didn't want to take a chance, so I followed it all the way to the end, and it was a tripwire. Enemy sappers had been busy during the night. They had planted these anti-personnel mines that we would have run through if we'd get up the next morning, went in that direction. And so I disarmed the mine. And as I dropped it, I looked up, and there was a Japanese soldier there. He was scouting for his outfit. And I was in camouflage, so he didn't see me until I moved. And I looked at this fellow. He was I was 18 then. He was 18. And he looked at me, and I could tell from the look on his face he was scared to death. And I know that because he held his Arisaki rifle up like this, as if to hide behind it. Just instinctively. And we looked at each other for, it seemed like a half an hour. It was only 5 or 6 seconds. When he fired his rifle, but it took him a while to get the rifle up to his shoulder, so I had a chance. I was able to drop down out of sight. And then I heard a click. I knew he had just popped a grenade. He threw it. I heard the grenade land behind me. I was carrying a Thompson submachine gun as a weapon. So the grenade landed behind me. I had no option but to move away from the grenade and toward him. So I stood up. I took a few steps. I fired a short round, another short round. Then the grenade went off and knocked me on my butt. My helmet was off. My weapon was gone. I was in the mud. And I looked up, and I could see this soldier, and he was sitting with his back against a tree. I went over to him. He was dead. I had killed him. I'd hit him right in the chest with one of the rounds. And I tried to, he was in agony. I mean, he died in agony because he'd bitten through his lip. And he looked uncomfortable, and I tried to straighten out his helmet. You do stupid things sometimes, and I couldn't move my right arm, so I knew that I was wounded. The grenade had punched a hole in my back. And then I I had lost a lot of blood, and before I could get him squared away, I passed out from blood loss. And I came to when our corpsman was giving me a plasma in my arm, and I looked over, and the Japanese soldier had been pushed aside, so his face was in the mud. And I hollered at the corpsman to get my friend out of the mud and stand up. You get a little, you develop an immediate association with somebody in a circumstance like that. And he propped him up, I took him out of the mud, he propped him up all right. And I asked him to look at his gear and get his picture. All Japanese soldiers carried a picture for identification when they get paid. As well, they used to tell us that the soldier carried a picture of himself in uniform, so that if he died, his ancestors, when he went to see his ancestors, would know he died a warrior. And so I asked the corpsman, Bill Hoagie, to take that picture out of his gear, and he did. He gave it to me, and I promised to carry it with me for the rest of my life. Not as a trophy or souvenir, but to honor him, because he gave his life for his country. I had great respect for our enemy. And I wrote this when a long time afterwards, when I was on the ship, I can think about it. This is called Lament. Is it all right if I read this?
Please.
I met a youthful enemy, his fear reflected in his eye. I loathed him not, nor did he me, but we must fight, and one must die. No longer boys, but not yet men, just sad young soldiers sick with fright. Flag and face our difference then. One timeless sleep would come that night. Panic grew with every breath. I had to kill, I had to try. Why do I seek this stranger's death? With vain despair I wondered why. I could be his friend, not foe. Such wish was true, not foolish whim. The brave young lad will never know. With tragic skill I murdered him. Long years have passed since when he fell. My heart still aches, no sense of pride. Though I seem here, I live in hell. On that cruel day, I also died. And I didn't know what, oh no, don't applaud. But I wrote the poem to drive home the fact of how sad I was that this young kid had to die, and why I had to beat it. Well, that's it.
Thank you.
So Mark, you were a medic in the Cav, right? So you had probably a time or two where you dealt with similar circumstances that Larry just did, except on the giving end of the aid. Would that be fair to say? Larry spoke about something that may seem foreign to some people, that connection, if you will, Larry, if I can use that word, to the gentleman that he had just personally gone to war with. With you being a medic in the Cav and seeing the action that you saw, did you see a lot of that same thing?
That's a tricky question. I think what makes the question a little more difficult is that it was a guerrilla war, and there were men and women involved on both sides. And it was a dirty war. It was cruel. So I can just tell you that from my experience, we ambushed some people, and they walked into this, what's called a big booby trap that we set. And they lost a bunch of people, but there were like 150 of these guys that hit this tripwire in the middle of the night. So we were 50 yards away, and they ran past and didn't see us, the survivors. So the next morning we, what's called recon the area, the 2 platoons. And because we heard these people, the casualties, they didn't die easy. And long story short, there was one woman who we thought was not alive, but she was. She'd been hit first by the claymores, and then she got hit again when we opened up on some other people that we thought were not being friendly. So she was wounded in the legs, and we walked over to her, and she was dehydrated because she bled a lot, and she kept clawing for my canteen, which was over here. And she's lying on her back, and she might have been like, I don't know, 20, 18, 20, my age at that time. And everyone in the platoon is looking at me. What's he going to do? What is he going to do? And my thought was, I was not politically or morally mature, quite frankly. My only thought was, if I give this woman water, that's the end of that canteen. And we're drinking, a canteen or 2 canteens a day of water. That's it. I'm thinking on that level, right? So I just acted automatically and got down, and I didn't have any clinical like sticks or splints. So we got some like rotten bamboo, and we used that, and then we tied, to make her leg stable because it was broken. And then we waited for the medevac to come in, and then the medevac came in and dropped the litter from the sky, and they hauled her up. And I just didn't feel anything. I knew everyone was looking at me. Am I going to help? What's he going to do? Because in our minds, the enemy was an alien. The enemy was a bug. The enemy was not human. So kind of difficult to empathize with. So they took her away. Later I found out that she was probably interrogated, and whether she lived or died, I'll never know. But in that, to get to the heart of your question, in that moment, was I feeling, unlike my friend here, was I feeling empathy for her? It wasn't there. I'm sorry to say it wasn't there.
May I say something?
Please go ahead.
I was down in the islands for 2 or 3 campaigns. When I first got there, and then we landed in Bougainville, I was of the mindset that we have to exterminate them like vermin, because we were told that. It wasn't until I saw my enemy up close and literally met him as a person, not any particular Japanese soldier, but the Japanese soldier. One instance, on Guam, there was a banzai attack where 3,500 enemy soldiers came over a ridge, and they were running through our lines. It was chaos. Everybody was shooting at somebody. And I had a friend, Andy Asante, who was in his hole, and he was firing at the Japanese soldiers coming over the ridge. And he didn't have one rifle. He fired his 5 rounds. The clip flung out. He was reaching in his cartridge belt to get another clip, and he looked up, and there was a Japanese soldier with an Arasaki 97 rifle about a foot away from his head. And he knew he was going to die. And then, a young soldier. And then he looked at Andy, he looked him in the eye, and he smiled and took off. He didn't kill him. That, when you meet people like that, you develop a contact. You're never friends. You never sit around and have a beer, but you understand what they're going through. And then when I realized that the Japanese soldiers were under order from the emperor to die, they had no choice. Their religion, the Shinto religion, had been taken over by the militarists in Japan, and they were told by the emperor was no longer the voice of God; he was God, and he told every one of those soldiers who were escorted, "Your mission is go to one of those islands and to die." And if he came home, his whole family would have to commit harakiri out of shame. So he knew. And I thought about taking a bunch of teenage American kids and tell them to go fight, but if you don't come back, you die. They'd say, forget it, pal. I love my country, but not that much. But when I realized that these guys were in that predicament, I could only pity them. And from that pity came an acceptance of them as human beings with an impossible mission. And so I had to feel something for them under those conditions.
Thank you. And Mark, I want to make this abundantly clear. You have nothing to be sorry about. you have absolutely nothing to be sorry about for the way that you felt at that time. I'm going to say that as a combat vet in Iraq who was doing exactly what we were hired to do. There's no judgment here. I'm going to tell you that from me to you, there's absolutely no judgment. And Larry kind of pinged and jumped on it a little bit, and I'm going to pick on you, Tom, a little bit. Because the way that we're trained, right, is not to see this as a human with, you know, a mother and a father and a brother and a sister. You had a unique position amongst the three of you folks where you were, I don't want to say in the rear, but you weren't in the head-to-head, if you will, combat. Being field artillery is just to, I'll let you give the specific details, but for those of you that may or may not realize is they're in a position behind,
My son, he was over behind.
basically behind where the front lines are, quote unquote. There's not really front lines so much anymore, but they're separated, I guess, geographically from wherever you're were you 155s?
Yes.
So 155 millimeter rounds, you know, the high explosive round weighs about 96 pounds, plus or minus, can go what, how
Up
far?
to 110.
Up to 110. So, I mean, we're talking some serious distance. Getting to the point that I was trying to get to is, how was it for you, for your specific experience, you know, knowing that you're putting rounds down range, whether they be high explosive rounds or incendiary rounds or white phosphorus to light up the night? How was it for you with that enemy, if you will, that you guys were going head-to-head with?
Well, so my situation was unique even for artillery. I was not, usually artillery is on a FOB, a forward operating base, which is very far away. Since it was 2013 to 14, we were officially doing the Shona Bashona, the shoulder to shoulder. We were supposed to be handing everything off to the Afghans, which really meant that we couldn't tell people that we were still fighting because we really couldn't trust them to do it. My platoon was put on what was called an assisting platform of an Afghan base. So it was an Afghan military base called Camp Parsa, and we sectioned off a little square quarter mile of it where we dropped our howitzers in and basically lived among the Afghans. A number of us, myself included, were also cross-trained to speak one of their languages. There's two official languages in Afghanistan. I was taught Dari, and then put into a Pashtun speaking area, so it was a little weird. I eventually picked up Pashtun, but so this area was actually very close to the Afghan front lines, and so we worked in conjunction with the Afghan infantry, and I would meet these young men, and they would get on their Chinook and you know, say goodbye to them, and then we would shoot for them while they were out, and then we would watch them bring their dead or their wounded back in. And it created a very unique position for me because, you know, it's guerrilla warfare. It's Afghans against Afghans in their country. And for me, it wasn't so much as an us and them. I was more facilitating to help them. And I could speak their language, and I got to know them very well. And many of them lived in the village right next door called Shambawat, where a lot of our attacks came from, where a lot of our work was. And it was at first it was a very surreal experience that the war really was at our front door, but I was invested in their war. I would speak to interpreters whose brother had become Taliban. I talked to young men who just loved America and hated their country and just wanted to go to California, and for some reason that was a big thing for them. We had one great interpreter. He taught me Pashtun. And I worked with him every day. We would sit, we would drink chai, which is their tea with like a pound of sugar in it. At night, we would watch Turkish soap operas, which are, I mean, amazing. You get to a point where you're just on guard and you're like, I need to know what happens to Faryat, fall in love with him. And so I developed this relationship with these Afghans on an immensely intimate level. This one particular interpreter, one day he didn't come to work, and that day we received 22 mortars. A number of Afghans were killed. Thankfully, the Americans were only injured. None of them were killed. And when he was apprehended, because he was the one that had given the coordinates since he worked in our base, he was brought through to us. And when he passed by me in cuffs, the only thing I could say to him was, "Chura, why?" And we would call each other Dostman, which means my beloved, my brother. And I just, "Chura." And the only thing he could say back to me was, "They have my family." And so I was in this huge moment of, this guy's not even my enemy. He has an enemy that's being used. And so it turned the whole sort of thing into a big muddle that is still sort of, kind of shows you the warfare today that has really gotten interwebbed, that has kind of progressed to the point that even the Afghans don't know who to trust and who's an enemy. And it gave me sort of a very surreal, almost a grandioso sense of everything, to kind of think of us as all really humans, and that while we are trained to dehumanize the enemy, there is a point where the human in us kind of says, why are they my enemy? And typically, it's things that they themselves don't even want to deal with. They're fighting themselves. I don't know.
I mean, I didn't have a standard answer, so that was fantastic. Thank you. Larry, you look like you had something that you wanted to share. No? Okay.
Let's listen to that.
So I want to thank all three of you guys for being up here. We're gonna wrap this section up. So what I want to give each of you a chance to do is we kind of finish this portion of the program is kind of open floor to say if there's a specific message that you wanted to get out by coming through here today. Encourage somebody to read someone, whatever the case may be. I'm going to start with you, Tom, because we kept starting with Larry all the time earlier.
I think for anybody telling their story or telling another story, having an audience is half the battle. And the fact that you are here tonight, the fact that people read books, the fact that people continually say, "I want to hear your story, I want to talk to you," is a huge thing that I think that for those of us up here need to say to everybody, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being the type of people that say, "I want to hear the story." That's huge.
Okay. Well, I'll keep it relatively short. When I met Bao Nin, the next day I interviewed him for 3 hours, and I wrote it up, and that's gotten some credibility. It's a good, people read it. And I had asked him all these kind of academic, dry, factual questions. And he's very patient. We were sitting on the lawn facing the ocean at UMass Boston, sitting on the ground cross-legged, and he had two of his friends and an interpreter. And, I asked him, can you tell me how you guys, what did you do? How did you plan your ambushes? And what kind of jokes did you tell? And did you write home? And what were your political beliefs? And stuff like that. It was just kind of abstract and not very emotional oriented. So then I was done, and I said, so do you have anything you want to say? And he looked at me, and he's very sort of contemplative and quiet and sensitive, but he's a very strong, powerful man and contains his emotions. If you saw the Ken Burns film, that one of the Vietnamese with his long gray hair and a long mustache, that's Bao Nin. And he wasn't happy with the Burns film, by the way, but that's another story. So I asked him, do you have anything you want to say? And it's something I didn't get to. And he said, tell your friends we were not robots. Tell your friends we were human beings. And it took a while for me to get that. To get that. And the other thing I want to say is that my friend here has written a book, and I've written a book. I just realized they kind of complement each other. Mine is a moments of lightness, but it's not the happiest book in the world, but it is informative. And he's written a book, and it's a little bit the other side. It's more humorous. It's more anecdotal. So I encourage you to buy our books.
My friend here is not only a writer, but he speaks well. I was at UMass sitting cross-legged on the grass. I mean, it comes right out. You write more easily than I do. But as you said, your friend said, remember, I'm a human being. Again, that was what I had to learn, that my enemy was a human being. And that the natives who populated the islands in which we were stationed, they're so different from us, their practices and everything. But they're people, they're human beings. We have to treat all alike. And on that theory, the one lesson that I learned from war and combat was the real meaning of the word love. Now, it's in Congress that you would say love, can't think of love and war and the horror of war in the same sentence. But that was the lesson I learned, was to love my mates. And they loved each other. When I think of how we were all teenagers. Well, I was old. I was 20. But in the first two campaigns, I was a teenager. And when I saw so many examples of young boys willing to give everything because they loved their friends, it's truly amazing. I'll tell you one fellow, Jack Lucas, enlisted in the Marine Corps at 15. He forged his birth certificate to make it look like he was 17. And then he forged his mother's name on a letter allowing him to enlist, even though he wasn't 18. So he went in the Marine Corps. When he got to Iwo Jima, he was aboard ship at the age of 16. And a week before he landed, he had a birthday. He turned 17. And we were all young kids. It was a young person's war. 5 days after his 17th birthday, he was on the island and he was taking cover with the other members of his fire team, and he saw an enemy hand grenade coming into their position. And some experience tells you it's a 7-second primer, and you time it subconsciously, and he's counting down the seconds, 5, 4, 3. I mean, or did reverse. 5, 6. And as it bounced, and he knows it's ready to detonate, he leaped up and he covered the grenade with his body and took the full effect of the blast because he wanted to save the lives of his friends. Now, he didn't have time to think about it. He probably had 4 or 5 tenths of a second to make that decision. And much like a parent with a child can be out and danger comes up, the parent will instinctively put the child behind and put their body between the danger. And you do it without thinking. And when you love people, as we love each other, you do that for your friends, for your mates. And I saw many examples of where we're in some kind of relative cover, and one of our guys is out there and he's wounded. And you see a young 18, 19-year-old boy get up from his protection and go to help his friend, and then get cut down with a machine gun before he can get there. And he's willing to offer, risk, and give his life for his friend. That love is so strong. It's just unbelievable. And because of that love we had for each other, I think those of us who survived and came home, it made us more gentle and more caring people. You go back to Shakespeare's Henry V. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, For he who fights with me today shall be my brother. And be he near so vile, this day will gentle his condition. Even then, war and the horror of war made people softer toward each other, or more affectionate. And I don't know whether I'm on the right track or not, but thank you.
How about a round of applause for our authors?
I think I quoted that already.
It's time to take a break, stand up, stretch. I encourage everyone to walk through and see the artifacts from the Patton Family Archive, please. Members of the Patton family are here tonight. Our curators from the museum and from the Patton Family Archive are around. If you have questions, let's take a half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour. We'll come back with our Gold Star families and wrap up our night.